Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're putting history itself on trial. Forget the dates and the battles for a minute. We're conducting a forensic audit. We're going to follow the money through centuries of transactions to figure out, to calculate how the past literally created the present.
And this quote, it sets the stage for us perfectly. The whole argument we're exploring today is that to really understand the story, you have to stop looking at the ink on the page and start looking at the calculator. It's all about following the money.
So this is the lens we're using. We are treating history like it's the ledger for a massive, centuries-long embezzlement case. We're asking the tough questions. Where did all the capital go? Who authorized these transfers? And how exactly were entire continents systematically stripped of their most valuable assets?
Now, every good audit has to start with an opening balance sheet. So our story doesn't begin with subjugation. It begins with sovereignty. We're going all the way back to the 14th century to the incredibly wealthy Mali Empire, a time when African leaders absolutely had the power and the autonomy to shape their own destiny on the world stage.
Okay, so this is crucial. The story starts with a king who understood a fundamental lesson about wealth. If you only supply the raw material, you're just a laborer. But if you control the distribution, you're a king. He looked at the Atlantic Ocean, not as a barrier, but as a highway.
And right here, you can see this fundamental clash in mindset. On one side, you have the cautious establishment, the let's just be content crowd. And on the other, you have this visionary leader, Abu Bakr II. He knew that to really build wealth, you had to risk your capital to create new assets and break the stranglehold that the middlemen had on his trade.
And get this wasn't just a few ships on an exploration trip. He launched an entire society. Scholars, engineers, soldiers on 2,000 vessels. It was a civilization on the move. And this moment right here represents the last great act of African agency and power in the Atlantic before the whole era of extraction began. So, after Abu Bakr's voyage, and then after Columbus arrives in the Americas, the whole relationship between Europe and Africa just fundamentally changes. Our audit now has to shift from tracking the creation of assets to documenting their seizure.
This is probably the single most important transaction in our entire audit. It's called the Great Switch. The primary demand from Europe shifts from African gold to African bodies. Partners in trade were about to be converted, literally, into property on a balance sheet.
So how did this happen? Well, the logic was predatory, and it was brilliant in a truly dark way. It's called the gun-slave cycle. It was basically an engineered arms race. By arming one group, Europeans could force all their neighbors to participate in the slave trade just to get the weapons they now desperately needed to survive. It was essentially a mafia-style protection racket, but on a global scale. And this dehumanization, it eventually gets encoded into law. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution literally does the math and values an enslaved person as 60% of a human being. And this wasn't just symbolic. It was a cold, hard calculation that gave slave states a third more political power than they should have had.
And all that political power was there for one reason: to protect an absolutely enormous financial asset. By 1860, the total value of the 4 million enslaved people in the United States was calculated to be $3.5 billion. This wasn't just a part of the American economy, it was the American economy.
I mean, to really wrap your head around the scale of this, just think about it. This single asset class, human beings, was worth more than all of America's railroads combined. It was worth more than every single manufacturing factory in the nation, and it was worth more than all the capital in every single bank in the country put together. Enslaved people weren't just labor. They were by far America's largest financial asset.
So, emancipation happens. But a system of extraction that valuable doesn't just disappear overnight. Oh no, it evolves. The embezzlement just keeps going, adapting through brand new legal and financial loopholes designed to maintain the old economic order, just under a new name.
And the key to this whole adaptation? It's a loophole, hidden in plain sight, embedded right in the 13th Amendment itself. Slavery is abolished, except as a punishment for a crime. That one little clause created a new, perfectly legal pathway to re-enslavement, criminalization.
This loophole leads directly to the system of convict leasing. States passed laws called black codes to criminalize just everyday life for black citizens. Then they leased them out as convict labor to corporations. And under this system, a human being went from being a fixed asset under slavery, where an owner at least had an incentive to keep them alive, to a disposable rental. Companies could literally work them to death and just lease another. Next, the system of control creates a paper prison. In the 1930s, the U.S. government institutionalizes housing segregation through a policy called redlining. This systematically blocked black families from getting home loans and building generational wealth. At the exact same time, the government was subsidizing white home ownership.
Then you jump ahead to the war on drugs, and you see this same racial bias mathematically encoded into federal law. You've probably heard of it, the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing ratio. It meant that having 5 grams of crack cocaine, which was associated with black communities, got you the same mandatory sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, which was associated with rich, white communities. The law itself was literally saying one was 100 times worse than the other.
And that brings us right into the modern era, where this model of extraction is literally traded on the stock market. You can buy shares in private prison companies. Their whole business model profits from keeping beds full, which creates a direct financial incentive for longer sentences and high rates of people returning to prison. The inmate becomes the inventory that generates value for the shareholder.
So, after centuries of this compounding theft, our forensic audit has finally reached the end of the ledger. We're at the final invoice. What's the total cost, and who owes it? The argument is that the bill for all of this is finally due.
And this framework, it reframes the entire conversation we have about this topic. According to this audit, reparations are not a moral plea for charity. No, they're presented as a collections action. It's just a financial reckoning for a multi-generational stolen asset, calculated just like any other unpaid corporate debt. The numbers that come out of these calculations are just staggering. Using standard economic models just to calculate the unpaid wages with a pretty modest compound interest rate, the debt for U.S. slavery alone is estimated to start in the trillions of dollars. This final figure really reveals the true mind-boggling scale of the asset that was embezzled in the first place.
Which brings us to the final and maybe most provocative question posed by this entire audit. It forces us to reevaluate what identity itself means, to see it as the ultimate asset. So the question is this: is your history rooted in the story of subjugation, or is it rooted in a forgotten story of sovereignty, a story not about slaves, but about emperors and navigators?